All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, we're going to be continuing, of course, with our tafsir, and we left off at point 34, okay? And we really were talking about, let's see, أو تحرير رقبة. So now we're talking about أو تحرير رقبة and the details of تحرير رقبة. Now it's important to discuss a little bit about تحرير الرقبة. What does that mean? It really is slavery, but of course the word تحرير means to free. الرقبة simply means neck. But this isn't talking about freeing necks, but this is a metaphor, but it was known that this is referring to freeing slaves. And why is it the neck? Because, when long ago, when they would, I guess, get the slaves, they would really chain them. So when Islam had come, Islam was about freeing the slaves, so it's removing the chains of these people, and Islam basically opened up many pathways to end slavery. But did Islam necessarily end slavery and just say, okay, if you got a slave, you just got to let them go? The answer is no. Islam didn't necessarily say go and let them loose like that, because what that was going to do, if that were to happen, you would end up with I guess massive numbers of homeless that don't even have any support and finding themselves really just out on the streets, not even having foods. And when you say homelessness, you're talking about an increase in the rate of crime, an increase in the rate of hunger, and the list goes on and on. So Islam considered a whole system, a whole program in order to end slavery and abolish slavery slowly, and certainly consider that as a way to bring about salvation, to bring about support to the slaves, whether it was including them as deserving zakat eligible, or whether it was also giving them the different rights to perhaps seek documents, or seek I guess different ways in order to buy themselves off. In other words, it becomes like a payment. And also Islam closed down the different ways that lead to slavery. So kidnapping was haram and certainly does not lead to slavery, but it used to before. Okay. Number two, and that was uh, the most important resource for slavery, it was actually riba. Riba, Islam ended riba and interest, and the main reason why Islam was against riba and interest was really because it was leading to slavery. Slavery was not exclusive to Africans. Slavery was including people that are Arab, including people that are white, Asians, Africans. It was not whatsoever a matter of color. But most of the slaves were certainly the cheapest slavery was considered the black slavery for a number of different reasons. The most important one was it was more prevalent in Africa, so it was cheaper to get those slaves from Africa than get the slaves from other countries, because it was harder to get them from those countries. It was harder to get them. At one point in Islamic history, white slavery was considered as cheaper. It was considered cheaper. I was doing the other day an estimation, how much was a slave costing? Not that I wanted to buy one, but I'm just wondering, in today's calculation, in today's numbers, what does that look like? The cost varied from time to time and on from one slave to another, but it wasn't that cheap. It was almost $50,000, $25,000, $50,000 to $100,000, and sometimes even more. So within our times, okay, we're putting the cost that it was considered as, well, it's not something that you would always have, I guess, have the money to afford. But I'm just letting you know. Now, I would say by far one of the best books that talked about slavery are two books, some of the best books. The first one that I really think everyone must read is Slavery in Islam, or in Islam, with Jonathan Brown. I think he probably did the best job in discussing slavery. The book is actually Slavery in Islam. The book is available for free. The book is available on YouTube to listen to the whole thing. Definitely one of the best books written on slavery in Islam. To summarize what he said on slavery in Islam, he was saying that slavery in the West has its own definition, had its own history, and had its own dynamic that is completely different than a than the system of a in Islam. Even though the word is translated the same way, speaking about it as slavery, but he said the system is completely different. And therefore the laws that relate to it, I guess the system, is it necessarily as brutal, as let's say abusive as what you would find in, let's say, in the history of slavery in the West? Number one is that irq is not at all similar to it, because irq, the person is supposed to be given housing equivalent to the housing that the master is living in, food, clothes. In fact, the person is not allowed to say abdi, my slave. He's not allowed, even the master is not allowed to call him or her as my slave, but they have to use words that give them dignity. And of course, in terms of food and clothing, they would have to live based on the same financial level as the person that they're living with. And at the same time, Islam was always recommending that they would not be overworked, that they would be given the spaces. And in fact, Islam went farther and regarded that freeing the slaves was one of the best actions that you could do to get you to Jannah. The other book that I would like to mention is a book that you will not put down. It's called Slaves of Allah. What that book is talking about, it's called Slaves of Allah, Slaves of Allah, Sylvie Dio, and I hope I'm writing her name right. I don't know. I know it's wrong, but this is the book. Servants of Allah. Did I say slaves? Yeah, servants. Oh boy. Servants of Allah. And what the book is about, she basically goes in details. Sylvie Dio, she goes in details. This is the copy that I read, and tries to research what happened to the African Americans, what happened to their heritage, because most of them were Muslim. Most of the African American slaves were actually Muslim. What did they do to maintain their Islam? And certainly, she put this picture, this slave actually managed to run away, and he was a scholar. And later, of course, this is to commemorate this person, but certainly the slaves, that's not what their image was usually presented as. They were usually, half naked, and always chained, all that. So this happens to be an exceptional person. And it goes into talking about the history of whatever she managed to find in perhaps in museums, manuscripts, whatever resources she was capable of finding and getting her hands on. And then she would basically list those evidences that really, I guess, expose and show us what they went through to try to maintain their identity. The amount of torture is unbelievable. The lifestyle that they were living compared to the master's lifestyle is, it'll make you cry and cry and cry, and you won't continue reading the book, but you won't continue stopping. But you cannot manage to stop, but you'll continue, and you'll stop many times because you'll just sit there and start crying. Who would do such a thing to a human being? Who would torture a human being in that way? And you'll also just keep that one in mind, because when you look at, in psychology, they'll tell us that trauma is one of those things that can actually change some things in your DNA. And trauma passes generations and generations. So if, for example, 4 generations ago or 5 generations ago, my ancestry went through some kind of a trauma, I may not know about it, but my behavior can speak it. And without me realizing, why am I behaving this way? Why is my brother behaving this way? Why do we have the tendency to do such behaviors or to probably panic in certain ways? It could be that it was a trauma that actually happened generations ago. So when we look at the agendas that surround the African Americans from preventing them getting the education that they want, or even the positions, and even the jobs, even the education system, all of that is another system, another agenda in order to prevent them from getting out of slavery. And very few had really managed to get out of slavery, and because the system itself was designed in order to keep them within, I guess, a system to abuse their powers, to abuse their energy, and subhanAllah. So just, those 2 books you really got to read. Definitely definitely Jonathan Brown. It was actually translated into a number of different languages. I think he did an outstanding job. Slaves of Allah, it was printed over 15 prints. Just imagine, and translated into many languages. Sylvie Dio herself is originally from Liberia, and that's where most of the slaves actually come from. So, okay, let's continue. So when we say تحرير الرقبة, remember, الرقاب, slavery, الرق in Islam is completely different than slavery. So I don't want you to come with this whole package of, I guess, images coming from slavery in the West and then applying it on Islam, because it's a completely different system. It gives them completely different rights. We're not saying that it's equal to being free, because even Islam doesn't recognize that. That's why Islam let you know that tahrir al-raqaba is one of the most virtuous acts that you could do, because there's nothing like freedom. Even if you're being fed by your master and given clothes and food, there's nothing like freedom. One of the stories to mention is Bu'ath and Mughith and Barira. Let me tell you the story. Barira was a Sayyidah Aisha slave. Barira, of course, she wasn't just a slave in Sayyidah Aisha's home, but by being a slave in Sayyidah Aisha's home, you definitely are going to learn a lot. So when she was married to Mughith, He loved her very much. But once Sayyidah Aisha had freed her, she felt that no, I don't want to live with Mughith anymore. She chose to get divorced. Mughith was really saddened because she chose to get divorced, because he didn't want to divorce her. He was in love with her. But Mughith is a slave. His life, perhaps bringing her trauma, who knows what, but she didn't want to be within that system. So Mughith would go to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, would go to Umar ibn al-Khattab, anybody, and just cry and convince them, I cannot live without Barira. Please convince her to stay married to me. So finally, he went to the Prophet ﷺ, and then the Prophet ﷺ was trying to convince her that he loves you, go back to him, etc. And she said, Ata'muruni ya Rasulullah? Are you ordering me, O Prophet of Allah? He said, no, I'm just interceding here. Just, trying to intermediate. That's it. And she said, she's not interested in going back. Now, here's one thing. The word is Ata'muruni ya Rasulullah. She said, do you order me, O Prophet of Allah? And from that, we could see that she had fiqh, that her ilm, and the ilm that she had studied, that she basically recognized that if it's an order from the Prophet ﷺ, that there's no question about it. But she also knew that if it's not a religious commandment, then in that situation, I don't want to go back. That's it. Why would she not want to go back? It seems that there's definitely a trauma to be within the system of slavery, even if she herself was not a slave, even if she just was married to a slave. It was going to be taking in a different system, a different style, and she definitely did not want to be within that, even though for sure she loved him dearly, but she loved her freedom even more. That's key. She loved her freedom even more. Now, when you look at Tahrir al-Raqaba, it's important to keep in mind that with Tahrir al-Raqaba, Islam was certainly considering that part of what would be as an expiation for making an oath is to simply, of course, is to simply end slavery along with it. So the expiation is to free you from all of those different things that probably, I want you to look into this. None of the books of tafsir looked into this one, but I'm sure that I guess we're seeing it from our times today and looking at the word miskin right there, and we're looking at the slaves. And usually these are the people that are considered at the lowest level, and the person committed a sin by breaking the Amen. So if they had committed a sin by breaking the Amen, why are we involving them with the masakin and with those that are going through slavery? Why not perhaps say build a road as an alternative to the sin that you had committed, or probably plant a tree, or maybe feed some dogs, or maybe, I don't know, stand in a certain place and start giving da'wah, or maybe, I don't know, sit in some kind of cave and do your dhikr right there for a whole 10 days time or something like that. You could see that there is a relationship between that and, choosing il-masakin. These are considered the lowest, let's say, social status within the society. Within the society, there's nothing lower. It's, there's definitely a system, whether even during our times, you're going to be an upper class if you're at a certain level, and you're going to be way upper if you're at a certain another level, and you're going to be lower and lower and lower and lower, and then you're going to keep going lower till you get to, well, this person depends on government assistance to survive, miskin, homeless, or this person is a slave. They really depend on someone else. In fact, they don't even have their own freedom. Okay. So when you look at that, I think it's important to relate it to the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ was making the dua. Allahumma inni as'aluka fi'la al-khayrat wa tark al-munkarat wa hubb al-masakin. It's important. You look at that one, fi'l al-khayrat. Did the person necessarily do fi'l al-khayr right here? No, they didn't. They didn't do what is khayr. Well, it can happen that من حلف على يمين فرأى غيرها خيرا منها. It could be that they had found that something else was better than the oath that they had made. But then what happened is that they had to break it because of something that is probably better. So what do we end up with? Well, we end up with, at the end of the day, you had broken the oath. وترك المنكرات, and leaving المنكر. But then the key one is حب المساكين, and loving المساكين. In order to love المساكين, you really have to be at close relations with them, giving them food, giving them clothes, and just seeing those smiles. Just relate with them. And that's why you saw that the majority didn't agree with al-madhab al-Hanafi. Al-madhab al-Hanafi was saying it's enough to give the value, and you don't really have to engage in actual feeding and actual clothing. Majority of the scholars, they said, no, this is really specific. The ayat are really specific. It's a specific wording. It's a specific alternative, and it didn't necessarily give you or give us or donate the amount. It didn't even mention or donate an amount of money. We didn't give that as an option. So the majority of the scholars, they said it's a specific relationship that is supposed to be coming out of this kafara. This relationship is a relationship that goes far beyond just money and giving and donating money. It's a relationship, you're creating a bond with the masakin, creating a bond with those that are considered as lower class, abused. Their energy, their work is abused. They're not even working towards their own life. All their effort is basically going in service to their master. They're not even putting services for themselves to see. It's going for their master. They don't even have the right to have basic freedoms to probably just do things. There's nothing probably anything more dishonoring, especially for a man, to be honest, than being a slave. You're being controlled by someone else, and you're not treated. You're not treated like a human being. You're literally treated like you are not at all having any right to even have any authority. I think, especially for a man, I think there's nothing worse than well, imprisonment is the same thing as slavery, Nora. It's a different kind of slavery than giving a man or taking away, sorry, the man's right to determine, decide, be masculine, be in power. Just imagine all of that. And subhanAllah, and when you look at tahrir raqaba, of course, that's why al-ikhraju min al-riq. It's Islam had made not only al-yamin as a way to protect the people and get them out of slavery, but it's uh, different ways that use the same let's say, channel, which is to free the slaves. We're talking about same thing when we're speaking about al-zihar, we're speaking about the Prophet ﷺ, the numerous hadith where he had considered that freeing slaves was one of the best and most virtuous actions that you could do. So tahrir raqaba is basically to free from slavery. And it also is right there. Of course, it's not a metaphor to say you're helping someone because of the hardships in dunya. No, this is a specific term. It's not to be translated literally or metaphorically. Of course, this basically is referring to slaves. Okay, let's continue right there. So why was it mentioning the neck itself? Why is it tahrir basically means free or freedom, and raqaba is neck. Why the neck? Well, that's because that was what they used to chain them in. They used to chain them. This isn't necessarily Islam, okay, but this was how they used to chain them. Okay, they used to chain them by putting things over their necks. And no, ya Allah, I can't imagine. And most of the times it would be, of course, for animals to make sure and to ensure that they don't run away. Let's see. And is it permissible to free a slave that is not Muslim? Now, what is the only channel that Islam allowed for slavery? The only channel that Islam left to slavery was during wars. Those hostages that are fighting fighting Islam and fighting Muslims, those hostages that were fighting the Muslims at one point, they basically are given a chance instead of being basically imprisoned. They would basically get I guess a second chance in life, and they would be the slaves. That's basically the only route that Islam allowed. Why did Islam allow it from the beginning? Well, Islam allowed it in the beginning because that was the method that it was used against Muslims. So it was more of a tactic, a war tactic than anything else. It was a war tactic. All right. So if they become Muslim, they don't necessarily automatically become free. No. That's why, of course, there would be a lot of slaves that are Muslims too, because they converted to Islam. Just because they converted to Islam, it doesn't mean that they become free automatically. No. But they will get the privilege of probably get included with the system that Islam was promoting, which is the system, for example, if a person were to make a yameen, they have a good chance to be probably included within the system that gives privileges for those mu'mineen. So that's one thing. So some scholars considered that no, it is supposed to be only for that system is only supposed to be involving a Muslim raqaba, a Muslim a slave. A Muslim slave is the only one that's supposed to be fitting within the qualification of which type of slaves are we supposed to be freeing here. Okay, so and at the same time, of course, we're freeing which type of slaves? So there are slaves that were considered mukatab or walad. What is that? So if, for example, we had a slave and this slave had basically made an agreement. It was like a financial agreement. And this slave is to work, let's say a part-time job or a full-time job, depends on what agreement is basically between him and his master. And this slave would basically pay some of what he is working in, and basically give it to the master. In other words, he's buying himself off. He's buying himself off. That's al-mukatab. There would be an agreement that, okay, I'll pay you $50,000. And out of these $50,000, of course, it'll be in installments. And I'm going to be working. And this money is going to be basically like a down payment until I finally reach the $50,000. I'll be free. So in that situation, can we say, okay, well, here it is, عقدتم الأيمان, we're going to be freeing a slave? No, we're not looking for somebody that is mukatab, because this person can be partially, let's say, on the road to getting freed, but we're looking tahriru raqaba. We're looking that you buy a slave, a complete slave, that's not partial slave, but a complete slave, and free them completely. What is walad? Walad, if a female slave, if we have a female slave, the female slave, if she does get pregnant and she has a baby, then in that situation, she is considered walad, which many of the female slaves wanted because it is a privilege, and they would be considered that they are now partially free because their children would simply be free children. And in that situation, of course, the master is going to see this woman as, well, this is the mother of my own child. Now he deals with her like she's his own wife. She wouldn't have the same privileges as a wife, but definitely it's putting her at a different rank. Okay. So when you're talking about freeing a slave, since she is partially free, then in that situation, the scholars, they considered that tahriru raqaba does not qualify freeing walad, a mother of a child. In other words, the mother, we're not talking about a woman and her child being slaves, to, and that this child belongs to the master. We're talking about this child. Now we're in this second scenario. Let's say this child was born in slavery, and this child was from somewhere, we don't necessarily know, etc., but not to this master. That's not an walad. Walad is only when we would have the master basically impregnate that woman, and then in that situation, that would be walad. Okay. It's important to mention part of those during Jahiliyyah, they actually struggled a lot, even though, I'll give you an example, Antar ibn Shaddad. Antar ibn Shaddad, he was actually known for his courage. He was known for his, I guess, physical strength. But Antar ibn Shaddad, his mother, was a slave and was from Ethiopia. His mother basically bore the child from Shaddad. Shaddad was Arab, but his father did not consider him as his son because he was black, because he was the son of a slave woman. So he didn't give him the privileges that he would give his other children. Ironically, Antar ibn Shaddad fell in love with his cousin, Abla. Abla loved him too. Abla was bint Malik, which is his uncle. But his uncle considered that, no, I can't get you married to my daughter, even though she's your cousin, because you are nothing but a slave. Well, Antar ibn Shaddad wasn't necessarily just a courageous man and known for his courage and known for his physical power, but he was also known for his eloquence and poetry. In fact, his poetry was so eloquent that it was actually considered part of the most seven eloquent poems that were hung in the Kaaba. The story and the romance between Antar and Abla were actually sung and taught as one of the seven mu'allaqat. Well, this isn't just Antar ibn Shaddad, but you're also talking about other Shanfara. What was that? Well, what is his name? Well, his name is a Shanfara. Well, that was really to talk about the lips. That was not his name, but he was actually known for his, I guess, lips because they were African lips. They were basically a sign of the history, the heritage, the ancestry that he had come from. But Ishanfara was writing the poetry that spoke of the pains that he was going through, and the poetry was so magnificent, by the way, in how he was not given jobs, how he was treated, how many of them found that because they wouldn't be hired, because they're ex-slaves, even though they're ex-slaves, but they wouldn't be hired, they would not be given respect. So they ended up living in the outskirts and really feeding on piracy, literally. So they were homeless. They found themselves homeless, and the only way to eat and survive, it was to basically throughout the night go and steal people's goods to survive. So Ishanfara wrote in poetry that would really make you cry of how, as a man, he was being treated in ways where he was always, I guess, in a society that is very tribal. He was seen as not having any protection, not having any power, not even having any humanity, and how he would talk about how he built a relationship with hyenas by living in those outskirts and, just going far away from the city, how he built better relationships with hyenas than relationships with people. Just imagine that. How can man be so cruel? How can man be so cruel to make a shanfara and make many like him actually be regarded as lacking humanity? But that's the reality. Now, looking at that, you would, I guess, just see the system, whether we're talking about the tribal system, or whether we're speaking about, I guess, the system. Of course, in the West, there wasn't a tribal system, but still, the system was really based on whether it's a social status or whether it's a financial status. At the end of the day, is that this system is definitely nothing but cruel in letting people struggle and be degraded and stripped away from their humanity and be treated where they would find hyenas as better friends than human beings. Just imagine that. Allah al-Musta'an. Okay, so what did Islam basically say? Well, if you're talking about tahriru raqaba and freeing a slave, well, what does that even look like? Let's say, can this be a slave that has a certain disability? Can this slave be an old slave? Can this slave be probably lame? Or can this slave be a person that is probably partial slavery, like mukataba, etc.? So that's, of course, or can the slave be a Muslim or not Muslim? That's the debate between scholars on that. So you had majority of the scholars say that no, the slave, in order for it to be here, tahriru raqaba, in order for this slave to be considered as a complete slave, then in that situation, we have to make sure that they're free of any disability. Why? Well, it's not that they're free from any disability, doesn't mean that we're not respecting people with disabilities, but it's in order to make sure that this person is going to be capable of, I guess, paying for themselves and not be dependent on others. So that's why they said, and what we're looking for is mild, something that would not affect them, certainly from being able to, I guess, survive and be able to probably manage to get a job. Because if this person is disabled, then it would definitely be better for them to be within slavery, because anyways, they're not capable of getting a job. If they're not capable of getting a job, then in that situation, being within the system of slavery is at least, let's say, less hectic on the government, because then we're looking at those that are capable later, of course, making their own financial means to cover for themselves. Salima ghayra ma'iba. So in other words, we're seeking someone that is not disabled, someone that is capable of working when they are free, someone that is not going to be a burden on the society or a burden on the government, but this person is going to be capable. If they're given the privilege of freedom, they would be capable of surviving, they would be capable of moving on. They just needed basically this support to get them out of the slavery system. Okay, so this is, just keep that one in mind. Abu Hanifa regarded that no, it's permissible to free a non-Muslim slave. Why? He said, well, what we're looking at, the term itself, it's at tahrir raqaba. It didn't necessarily specify that it's supposed to be mu'min, Muslim. It didn't really say anything in regards to its faith. In other words, he just took the word literally without any restrictions to what this raqaba is believing in, and said, well, لأن مطلق اللفظ يقتضيها, because the wording itself, in this absolute wording, the comprehensive statement is just saying tahrir raqaba, freeing a slave, and didn't specify whether it's a Muslim or not a Muslim. Okay, now the other scholars, and here he says daliluna, meaning the Malikis, he said, well, this is supposed to be a type of an obligation. It's a religious duty. And since this is a religious duty, then there's no way that a person that is not Muslim can contribute to a religious duty that you're doing. This is their evidence. Exactly like zakah. And not every single time, according to the Malikis, not every single time that you would see an absolute term in the Quran would necessarily mean that we would just leave it as is, because we had seen that in other statements in the Quran, in situations when a person had killed another person by mistake, it specified that in order to make this expiation for making up, of course, for killing by mistake, that it has to be a raqaba mu'mina, that it has to be a believing slave that you're freeing. So they said it doesn't have to every single time tell you that it has to be a believing slave. but just in the indication in another religious commitment, in another religious expiation, it was telling you that it has to be a believing one. So the majority of the scholars, they said, well, that's a sign right there that religious duties are supposed to be bringing in a channel for more religious duties. So it's not just taking the words in their comprehensive statements. All right. So let's say, and when we're speaking about لا يكون فيها شرك, what is لا يكون فيها شرك? Or even a person, what if a person is Muslim, but this person is, I guess, some kind of a slave that is committing innovations, committing shirk, etc. Would we also consider that as a valid expiation? Well, that's the thing, is that also different opinions between scholars. Okay, so I'm just going to go really quick over it. And of course, when we're speaking about freeing from different disabilities, I think that one was kind of clear right there, because tahrir raqaba, they said, well, that simply means, just by the word tahrir raqaba, that simply means that it has to be a complete neck and not half a neck, even though it's not literally. But of course, they were saying if it's perhaps blind, perhaps with a disability, where's the evidence from? Well, they said, well, there's a hadith sahih that the Prophet ﷺ said, ما من مسلم يعتق امرئا مسلما إلا كان فكاكه من النار عضو منه بعضو منها حتى الفرج بالفرج وهذا نص. So what did he say? That the Prophet ﷺ said every single Muslim that would free a slave, a Muslim slave, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would simply free, or at least save from hellfire, with every single gland, with every single extremity that they had freed, even if we're speaking about the private part with a private part. In other words, you would free that slave, then you would be freed from hellfire. Your neck would be freed, your arm would be freed, your leg would be freed, your eyes would be freed, even your private parts would be freed. All of that would basically be to free you from hellfire. So this is the evidence. The evidence that they said, you definitely want to consider that if we're freeing a slave, we're looking at making sure that you're getting to the highest of what would be giving you the privilege in the hereafter. And certainly, what if somebody is one-eyed? You have two differences of opinions. I'm just going to go over it really quick. What if من أخرج مالا ليعتق رقبة في كفارة فتلف? What happens? Well, let's say they basically had the money. So they said, hey, we're going to buy this slave. And they agreed with this money, with this person, that they're going to buy this slave. I guess they had a title or something. Here we go. In that way, I can basically free the slave. But then the money, it basically somehow gets lost. The money, uh, the title, who knows what happened to it, and something happens. Okay. So does that mean that's too bad for the slave? They were going to get freed, but then the money probably went to the wrong person. Maybe we were transferring the money, but then the money went to the wrong person. You know, these kind of things do happen. We tried to get it, but then the bank, they said they can't. It's already going into their account and you're too late, etc. So in that situation, does that mean it's basically too bad? Well, no. He said, كانت الكفارة باقية عليه. You still own, you still didn't pay the expiation. You still owe the expiation, because you basically were supposed to be doing the actual freeing the slave. And this was not accomplished. If it wasn't accomplished, then you can't consider that the expiation is now, okay, well, I tried. The money went to somewhere else. It's not my fault. No, we're still considering that expiation was not yet accomplished, and you have to basically make sure that you would pay an expiation. And if we're speaking about freeing the slave, then you would have to work towards that again. What if the person, they wanted to pay zakah, or wanted to basically give it to the poor, of course, or wanted to pay, I guess, money in order to free a slave, but then they couldn't. Something happened. The money was gone. Something happened. In zakah, the situation is different. In zakah, the situation is different. They don't have to pay an alternative because it was out and deducted out of their balance. But for kafara, il-kafara would not be considered accomplished until you actually do the job. But for zakah, it's enough to deduct it out of your money. Let's say you wanted to pay, I don't know, $20,000 in zakah. You must have had a lot of money. But let's just assume wanted to pay $20,000 in zakah. You sent it to Araha. Let's just assume that organization, we don't want to defame any organization, let's change the name, okay? That organization, any organization, okay? This organization was sending money to Africa, but later it was discovered that this organization was a scam. Do I have to redo my zakah? No. But what if it was for yameen? Do I have to do my expiation? The answer is yes. If you discover that that organization was a scam. Why? Not the zakah. Because the zakah, it should suffice that you basically had deducted it from your wealth. But for the expiation, it wouldn't be considered as accomplished until it really gets to these things happening. Okay? You see the difference? Of course, with differences of opinions. Let's see, what if the person that did the oath basically died? What happens to them? So in that situation, we would deduct the expiation from the wealth that the deceased had left behind. Abu Hanifa added another restriction, and he said the expiation cannot be more than 1/3 of the wealth that was left behind. If it's more than 1/3, then he holds accountability. Okay, let's see. And according to Malik, well, if he had made a will, and it is part of Islam, if you have money to write a will, and every single day you would basically write the will and put it underneath your pillow. Let's say Noura has, I don't know, $500,000. And she would write the will, I want this much donated to, I don't know, Gems of Light, or this much donated to the Islamic Center, that Islamic Center, etc. Then it cannot exceed more than 1/3 of your $500,000, because the rest is going to go in inheritance to your family. Okay? But you would have a wasiyah. That is a sunnah. Can a wasiyah be obligatory? Yes. When would the wasiyah be obligatory? The wasiyah would be obligatory if you had certain debts that you owe. Let's say you owe someone $20,000 or $30,000, and you didn't tell your husband about it. Then in that situation, I owe XYZ $20,000. I'll pay them the $20,000, etc. That would not be included within the third. The third would only be considered if we're talking about a will. But if, let's say, you owed someone money, let's say the amount that you owed was taking away all your money, then in that situation, Even if it took away all the money, that would basically go in covering the debt. Even if it took all the money, yes, even if it took all the money, because that's a debt. The 1/3 of the money is only if we're talking about a will. Okay, let's continue. And that's the same thing, of course, for Malik. He said only if the person had basically made the will, that I made an oath the other day and I did not and I did not um and I did not pay the expiation, then in that situation we would basically consider that as a debt that they owe. Okay, if they had made al-wasiyah. So certainly the debt comes first. Before any distribution of inheritance is done, we first have to, number one, takfeen and tafseer al-Maida. The cost for washing and shrouding and burial is to be deducted from the person's money. Then we would look into if they owe any debt. They owe anyone any wealth. Then finally, if there remains any money, that's when we're going to say, well, let's now see the inheritance. Okay, so yes, definitely debt comes first. Okay, what if the person actually was rich? They made an oath, but they didn't do the expiation. And they kept on procrastinating, and now they lost all their money. Or they had broken their oath when they were poor, but then they didn't actually do the expiation until they became rich. Or a person broke their oath while they were slaves. They didn't pay the expiation or they didn't pay the expiation, and then they were freed. So what do we consider? We would consider the time that, let's say, وقت تكفيره لا وقت حنثه. So we would basically take in consideration the timing when they were supposed to pay the expiation and not the time that they had broken their yameen. So what does that mean? وقت تكفيره لا وقت حنثه. So we would say, okay, where you were, let's say, they had broken the oath when they were rich, but then they were procrastinating until they became poor. So now we're going to say, okay, during this time that you were supposed to do the takfir, that is basically the expiation. Okay, so now what is your status right now? Right now, I don't know anything. Okay, can you afford to pay 10 needy people? No. Can you afford to clothe them? No. Well, sir, you're not going to be able to afford buying a slave and freeing him. Okay, what to do? Fast 3 days. I actually have diabetes and high blood pressure. I can't fast. Just do istighfar. You see it? And so what are we considering? We're considering their status right now. Were you rich at one point? Yeah, he was probably rich at one point. But right now, he's poor. He can't even afford to probably feed himself. Then in that situation, we're going to look at your ability right now. But of course, the person will be held accountable for procrastination. All right, let's continue. This hadith is extremely important. So we're at point 39. Let's look at this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, Wallahi la'an يلج أحدكم بيمينه في أهله آثم له عند الله من أن يعطي كفارته التي فرض الله. What does that mean? If a person لأن يلج, in other words, if a person were to break the oath, it is better to break the oath than somehow thinking that no, they want to be firm, they want to be people of integrity, and let his family probably struggle and him himself go through struggles of wanting to keep the oath. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying, you need to really measure the situation. If it's better for you to break the oath and the harm was less, then do so. And don't let the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be an obstacle and put yourself or put your family in bigger harm. Because by putting them in bigger harm, that would be considered even a bigger sin than breaking the oath. What is al-lajaj fil yamin? It's basically being committed to the oath. So if a person were to stay committed to the oath and there was a lot of struggle and a hardship on the family and on himself, then in that situation we would say, no, don't do the oath. Don't stay committed to it. Break the oath. Get your family and yourself out of this hardship and pay the expiation. And what is the other supporting evidence? وَلَا تَجْعَلُوا اللَّهَ عُرْضَةً لِأَيْمَانِكُم. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and do not let the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be an obstacle to لِأَيْمَانِكُمْ أَن تَبَرُّوا. Do not let the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be an obstacle from you engaging in good. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, مَنْ حَلَفَ عَلَى يَمِينٍ فَرَأَى غَيْرَهَا خَيْرًا مِنْهَا فَلْيَأْتِ الَّذِي هُوَ خَيْرٌ وَلْيُكَفِّرْ عَنْ يَمِينِهِ. Okay, let's continue. Now we're at point 40. We're almost done. Okay, let's look at this hadith. روى مسلم عن أبي هريرة قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم اليمين على نية المستحلف. This is key. In what? In qada. What is qada? In trials. What is yamin supposed to be for? Yamin is supposed to be for bringing in a confirmation that you're really honest. You're basically making Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be as the one that is witnessing what you're doing. Certainly, we don't know if you're lying or not, but we would use al-ayman as a way to somehow let you bring your religious integrity in place and tell you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to hold you accountable. But here's the thing. Let's say I'm going to Salwa. And Salwa, I said, I'm missing my golden ring. Did you see it? And she said, no, I didn't. But then there was only me and her, or her and I. No one else was there. So I said, there was no one else, and I don't remember misplacing it. I would like that you make an oath that you did not take that ring. So Salwa is wondering where she could say, Wallah, I didn't take it, and then use inshallah as a way out and an exit. Wallah, I didn't take it, and then secretly say inshallah. Or say, Wallah, I didn't take it, and in her mind, she was referring with it, the pronoun it, referring that she didn't take her car. And here I am, I'm asking her about the ring, but she was saying, I didn't take it, and referring to the car. I was asking you about the ring, but I didn't know that in her mind, she was referring to the car. But of course, what I understood when I asked her about, well, say, wallah, you didn't take the ring, she basically just said, I didn't take it. She did what is called tawriya. What is tawriya? Tawriya is it's a way of lying where you would let the person that is listening to you believe that you're talking about one thing, but in your mind, you're talking about something else. That's tawriya. All right. So in that situation, the Prophet ﷺ, in order to definitely keep honesty and trust between people. The Prophet ﷺ said, اليمين على نية المستحلف. What is that? اليمين, the oath that you would make, is, remember that sin and the tat when they come together, the alif sin tat right there, this al-mustahlif is the person requesting the oath, or the person requesting the oath. So let's say I'm right there saying, say wallahi you didn't take it. And she said, wallahi I didn't take it. Now, whose intention is this yameen supposed to be based on? The person that's requesting al-mustahlif, the person that's requesting that you would make the oath. So if I'm here saying, say wallahi I didn't take it, it's very obvious I was talking about the ring, and don't whatsoever think that, oh, I'm actually having the intention of something else. That in that situation, if the person had lied about it and said, well, I basically my intention was something else, then in that situation, that's a lie. And then the person, their intention would be based on the intention of the person requesting al-yamin. Same thing if we're talking about al-qada. If we're talking about situations where there's a dispute between people. And then the qadi is asking that you would make that oath. Al-Qadi is asking you to make that oath to make sure that we are seeing a case of honesty here. That in that situation, the Qadi's intention, who's the mustahlif, would be what you're making the oath for. And certainly your own intention and what you meant by that, it would not get you out of being held accountable for whatever oath that you had made. And that's basically what the Prophet ﷺ was saying. يَمِينُكَ عَلَى مَا يُصَدِّقُكَ عَلَيْهِ صَاحِبُكَ. Your oath is basically supposed to be as a confirmation of what your friend is going to be trusting you for. That's the whole reason for a yameen anyways. And if the person, let's say Imam Malik, he said, if the person were to make some kind of an istithna, that exception, say inshallah, or probably make another exception. Perhaps, let's say, did you take the ring? And she said, wallah, I didn't take it. And then privately, and probably in a low voice, say, when it was on the table. But she did take it. But it was in the cabinet. But what did she say? I made a complete yameen. I didn't lie. Then in that situation, of course, this type of an exception, or this type of probably a parenthetical clause that they had probably privately or later said, does not whatsoever uplift the accountability. Why? Because the intention is basically referring to whatever is intended right there that we're talking about, referring to number one, the intention that al-mustahlif had basically asked you, the person that's asking you to make the yameen, it's based on their intention. Because the whole yameen was really just to confirm their right. And therefore, your own choices of what you want to consider as a person making the yameen, that's not an evidence that we're going to be considering. This is serious here because it's basically part of it. Okay, let's continue. 40.41. فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ. And whoever does not and cannot find basically to pay the expiation, all right, then in that situation, whether we're speaking about feeding, clothing, or even freeing the slave, then in that situation, the person, if you don't have the money to do so, then that's the only situation that you would be given the permission to fast 3 days. Okay, so what if the person had the money in his hometown, but now he doesn't have access to his money? Differences of opinions between scholars. So they had the money. Let's just assume that this family owns a lot of money and a lot of land and a lot of homes in Syria. It's worth a lot of money. But right now, due to the war, due to the political situation, they don't really have access to that money. Right now, at least. And they can't have someone sell it, and they can't, they don't even have access to that money. It's there, yeah, but now we can't go get it. So does that mean they're considered that they have the money, or does that mean they don't have the money? The money, they don't have access to it, that's فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ. If you don't have access to the money. So two differences of opinions between scholars. The first one, that, hey, you'll wait until you go and you have access to that money. And the second opinion is that no, you don't wait to do the expiation. If you don't have the money and you don't have access to the money, then in that situation, it's considered like you don't have the money because you don't have full power over that money yet. So right now, we're going to see that technically you don't have the money and you would fit within the category فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ, that if you couldn't find the money, then in that situation, according to the second opinion, that if you don't have the money technically, then you would go for the second option, which is فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ. The first opinion, no, you've got the money. Technically, you do have the money, or at least in reality, you do have the money. You just don't have access to using the money. Why don't you just wait until you get access to the money and then pay the kafara then? But the second opinion said, no, why wait? You never know. Right now, you don't have the money. You don't technically own the money right now because you don't have the ability to use it. Then in that situation, you won't be held accountable, and you simply just fast because you're fitting within the category فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ. You don't have access to it. Okay, I'm just trying to, as much as I can. What if, and how much is فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ? How much is, well, if they cannot afford food and feeding 10 people, or what does that look like? Is this talking about having enough food for just a day? Or is this talking about the person fears probably hunger? What does that look like? How much is in nisab? What is in nisab? In nisab is considered as the limit, kind of like in the government, they will consider, you would be considered as qualified to receive, let's say, assistance if you owned, let's say, $4,122, for example, for a family of, let's say, 4 or 5, etc., then in that situation, you would qualify for assistance or you wouldn't qualify for assistance. So in Islam, there's a nisab as well. You would qualify to pay zakah or not qualify to pay zakah if you basically don't have the amount of zakah, or if you don't have the amount to feed 10 people, you don't have the amount to clothe 10 people or free a slave, then in that situation, that's فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ. But if you have the money to feed 10 people and you had the money to give that clothing 10 people, then in that situation, this is within your capacity, then that's what you have to do. You can't say, well, I'll just go fast. No, that's only if you cannot afford to do these three in one of these three categories. Let's see, 42, we're almost done. Fasting 3 days. فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ. Now, is it supposed to be consecutive or not? Oh, there are differences of opinions between scholars. The reason why, because Ibn Mas'ud had read it فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ مُتَتَابِعَات, consecutive. Okay, some scholar, well, we don't see this متتابعات in our قراءة, Hassan an Asim or Warsh, etc. We don't see it in those قراءات. And that's the majority of the scholars. They considered that no, it doesn't have to be consecutive. It doesn't have to be consecutive. And therefore, you got Malik, Shafi'i, they basically said it can be on different days and doesn't have to be consecutive. And therefore, to somehow say that it has to be consecutive, the ayah is just saying, فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةَ أَيَّامٍ. Then you have to fast 3 days. There was no note or any specification that it has to be consecutive whatsoever, and therefore that's the opinion that they had taken. 43, if a person were to من أفطر في يوم من أيام الصيام ناسيا, what if a person was fasting in making this expiation, but then they broke their fast? Then they broke their fast. What happens? Do they have to redo, or does the rule in general, if you broke your fast that due to forgetting, then whoever breaks their fast due to forgetting, then they would just continue their fast? Does that rule fall within this category as well? The answer is yes. Yes. Whether that's for an expiation, or whether that was for fasting Ramadan, or whether that's for an obligatory, or let's say a non-obligatory fast or an expiation fast, the rule falls the same thing. If a person had eaten or they had basically drunk something when they were fasting, the rule is the same. It's basically considered as they were fasting, and therefore they don't have to make it up. Okay, we're almost done right there. Got 44, 45, and then and 47. Because those points, I didn't think they were relevant to basically give that tafsir for it. Let's see. Let's go really quick. Okay, so 44. Okay, so no, let's skip that one. ذلك كفارة أيمانكم. What is it, kafara? We talked about that. So in kafara, we said it's to hide something. It could also be to, remember the kafara, we talked about the different things that relate to that root. So in this situation, this is basically to say that this is to hide, to remove, to erase the yameen that the person had broken. So this is to remove the sin of what they had committed. Okay, let's see. من حلف في قطيعة رحم أو فيما لا يصلح فبره ألا يتم على ذلك. Let's see, number 1 right there. Let's see. إسناد ضعيف لضعف حارثة بن أبي الرجال. Okay, so this hadith is not authentic, but let's read it anyways. Whoever makes an oath in disconnecting their family ties, or in what is not right to do, then what they have to do, in other words, the best commitment is to not be committed to that oath. But this hadith is not authentic. But in general, this is definitely authentic. من حلف على يمين فرأى غير خير منها فليأتي الذي هو خير. Let's see, point 46. We already talked about that one. Doing a yameen in other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make an oath in other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is there supposed to be an expiation? Some scholars said that they basically have to pay an expiation exactly like they would pay the expiation when they would be doing an oath in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because at the end, they broke a yameen. They broke an oath. And therefore, they would be held accountable and at sin for making a yameen with other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right. The second opinion is that no, this isn't anyways an oath, and therefore they don't have to pay any kafara. Because anyways, it's not a valid yameen anyways, and not a valid oath anyways, so why would we say they would have to pay kafara? وَاحْفَظُوا أَيْمَانَكُمْ. So this is the general rule that we're supposed to be being committed to our oath. That's the general rule. Be committed to the oath, and therefore لعلكم تشكرون, it would be thankful for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you. You're lucky you're not part of the masakin, you're lucky you're not a slave, and therefore be committed to your oath and be committed, of course, and have that commitment in order for you to be part of shakirin, because whatever you would basically donate in, it's basically to help you be thankful for what you have. And this is basically completing the 47 points. I tried to do all of them and tried to summarize it. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So now I'm going to do this. All right, if there are any questions, go ahead. Can you hear me? Or was it too low? No one has any questions? Okay, you want to write them down? That's okay too. I guess everybody's like you already past the time. All right, so this is it. Inshallah, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant.
جزاك الله خير.
وإياكم ربي يحفظ. And what's the other one?